Well, thank you. I've actually put up a slightly sexier title than the one that was originally in the program. Um, Wanted to congratulate David on as usual, a very impressive talk. And he managed to avoid the major mistake that all speakers make currently, which is mentioning Donald Trump. This is not a mistake I'm going to make, or rather, actually, is a mistake I'm going to make. Um, and indeed, but I'm going to be in a slightly unusual way, and I'm going to make a favorable reference to Donald Trump. But you'll have to wait for that to see how we go through. Let me start with a reference to another American, Thornton Wilder. He's a novelist, a playwright, wrote the play Our Town and the play The Matchmaker, and had this quote that money is like manure. It's not worth a thing unless it's spread around, encouraging young things to grow. So the idea is that somehow that wealth that is just concentrated in particular in the elderly generation, it stifles the growth of the younger generation, and we can stimulate that growth by spreading it around. Another US academic, Michael Sheridan, who has led some of the more interesting developments in this area, talking about assets or wealth. That income only maintains consumption, but assets change the way, wealth changes the way people think and interact about the world. With assets, people think in the long term and pursue long-term goals. Incomes feed people's stomachs, but assets change their minds. There's quite a lot of evidence about this, actually, that there's been a lot of longitudinal studies in the US and the UK, and they find that people who own assets, in other words, people who have wealth, when compared with those who don't, they have better health, lower mortality, interesting enough, higher marital stability, less domestic violence, better educational outcomes for children, and higher savings when children become adults. On a more specific, looking at the younger generation specifically, asset holding, that's having a small amount of wealth at 23, has strong links with the time spent in full-time employment, with earnings at age 33, health of men and women at 33. And the interesting thing too is that these links remain even when you control for all the possible confounding factors such as income, social class, and personality, and even personality type. You still get these things, this sort of a wealth effect, an asset effect, which seems to dominate the future life course of a generation. So that suggests that that if we're going to use inheritance tax, or indeed any other tax, but let's think of inheritance tax for the moment, to improve the lives of the younger generation, perhaps the way to do it is to spread capital ownership through some sort of what we increasingly call universal basic capital, parallel with universal basic income. There have been a number of universal basic capital ideas over the years. The first is probably Tom Paine in the 18th century, with £15 for every 21-year-old paid for out of inheritance tax. I think I can claim to be the person who introduced it into modern discourse in 1989 in a book which was entitled Market Socialism, which may turn out to be very prescient or may turn out to be incredibly dated, but we shall see. I recommended a grant of £10,000 given to everybody at the age of 18, funded again by inheritance tax. There have been other ideas. This is Bruce Ackerman in the United States who recommended $80,000, sizable amount, at the age of 21, funded that from a wealth tax. IPPR came up with the inspiring name of a baby bond, which is a small grant at birth, not at 18, but at birth funded by general taxation, funded from general taxation. I do think that it's a very shrewd choice of term. Of course, it isn't a bond at all. It's not a bond in any real sense of the word. It's I called mine in the parallel with a poll tax, which is a flat amount raised which is a flat amount raised out of taxation paid for by everybody. I called mine a poll grant, which shows what a poor politician I am, and compared with baby bond, which is a much more shrewder idea. And in fact, it inspired me. I worked for a while at the European Commission, and it inspired an idea for the European Union to do this. It was still in the good old days when we were members of the European Union, and to give a grant to every European citizen, which we had a lot of fun what to call it, and ended up with calling it a Bambini bond. Unfortunately, it never happened. But what it did happen in the UK, we developed this idea called the Child Trust Fund. It was along the lines of the baby bond that was giving a savings account open for every child, every born from 2003 onwards, for every baby born had an account provided, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. And here is the exciting moment that you've all been waiting for, which is the mention of the Donald Trump, who has, believe it or not, is introducing a scheme for universal basic capital, which I'll explain more about in a moment. Let me just say a word about the Child Trust Fund, which, in an act of policy vandalism undertaken by the Cameron government, was abolished in 2011. The idea was that every child at birth received a grant of £250. All types of account were available. You could put it into shares, a savings account, or even Sharia accounts. Children from disadvantaged families got rather more, particularly if they had a disability, but just from disadvantage, got another £250. At the age of 7, parents, the further voucher was put in. Children in care got more money. So to some extent, it was targeted. Parents and grandparents and 12 friends and children save up to £1,200 in the account, and the income from the account was tax-free. And the account available for use when child reaches 18. No restrictions on use. I was involved to some extent in the setting this up, and we had lots of debate about the restrictions on use question. It might be interesting when we have if we have discussions to what people think that universal basic capital ideas should have a restriction on use. We came to the conclusion in the end that there should be no restrictions on the use. It was launched with great fanfare in 2003. It was launched in Number 10 with Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Blunkett, Alistair Darling, a number of people all vying to sort of take credit for it. It was rather widely welcomed across the political spectrum. The extreme left didn't like it. The extreme right didn't like it because they said it was another welfare handout. The extreme left didn't like it because it was too individualistic. It was it's not a collective, sort of leading to a property-owning democracy, and the extreme left didn't like it. But between those extremes, it got a very wide sort of popular reception. Um, uh, oh, I say yes. I should have mentioned the idea was to provide financial help and education alongside. I think we had the idea that actually that people would have printouts of their accounts. Children would have printouts of their accounts, and they would bring them into, e.g., primary school or indeed secondary school, and we get advice as to what they were doing and how they should work, or generalized education in financial literacy. Um, um, well, sadly, as I say, they were abolished in 2011. It was after the financial crisis. The coalition government came in, decided that it was on the lookout for desperate attempts to cut public spending, and they seized on the Child Trust Fund accounts as a very sort of very easy way to get a quick win. Of course, I mean, the interesting thing about it was that there was no immediate, people did not perceive an immediate loss from this. It was going to happen when the child was 18, many years in the future. Of course, there was a loss and there would be a loss. However, there was no immediate loss to anybody. So it was a way of cutting public spending without anybody, in a sense, noticing that it was cut. So the policy then began to die. I mean, it obviously it died in the sense for the newcomers, obviously, because then they new babies, including my first grandchild who did not receive it, being born in 2012, much to my irritation. And actually, more generally, the policy it lost momentum, even for those who still had child trust fund accounts. It has become some of the accounts are now maturing. They're maturing with sort of some of them reasonable sums. There are some even with about £10,000 because parents, grandparents, and so on have been putting money in, and so on. But there's a large number of the population who don't know that their children have got these accounts, even, and they're trying to spread this around, spread the information around, and the sort of average amount, I think the average amount that's great is running at about £2,000, £3,000. The financial help and education was not offered. So in a sense, the policy sort of has expired without creating the kind of impact that I think we all hoped it would when it was first introduced. Well, since that time, there has been quite a lot of interest in a number of countries in this idea, the general idea of universal basic capital. It attracted quite a lot of attention in the United States. Hillary Clinton, in her first presidential run for president, had the idea of putting $500 into the beginning of an account. Unfortunately, she blew it because when she made her speech about it, she talked about $5,000 rather than $500. And at the time, $5,000 was a lot of money, and she had to withdraw the idea very quickly in terms of the criticisms that she got. Cory Booker, a US senator, he also came up with the idea of the language was very often used of that of the baby bond rather than the universal basic capital idea, but introduced the idea of baby bonds. and a number of US states, in fact, have actually introduced a variety of schemes that are targeted. They're calling them baby bond schemes, often targeted and often involved for the younger generation. For poorer groups in the younger generation. However, in 2020, in a few months ago, what I regard as quite astonishing development, Donald Trump or the Trump administration proposed the Trump accounts. It was actually announced and advertised at the Super Bowl, the Super Bowl. And the idea was that every child under 18 with a valid social security number of a Trump account that opened by the US Treasury. The government would make a contribution, a federal deposit of $1,000 for children born between the 1st of January 2025 and the 31st of December 2028, the end of the second term of the Trump administration. They could make additional contributions, just like in the British system, that families and others may contribute up to $5,000 a year, indexed to inflation. Employers may contribute up to $2,500 a year. Again, and this will be tax-free, excluded from the employee's taxable income. And charities and other general funders may also contribute, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Investment rules, well, there are some rules about how it's investment. It has to go in low-cost equity index funds. Oh, sorry. And in terms of access and withdrawals, just as I didn't mention with the UK Child Trust Fund, there can be no withdrawals from the account until the child reached 18. That's got the same rules here. And after 18, the accounts are treated as general standard IRA accounts, with the withdrawal subject to the ordinary IRA tax rules. And again, no restrictions on use. So very similar in many ways to the Child Trust Fund. But really, again, another very surprising development is that the Michael Zell of the computer dynasty, so to speak, and set up a foundation, and they're making a contribution that they committed $6.25 billion to support these Trump accounts. It doesn't replace the $1,000 seed deposit. It sort of adds to it a supplementary benefit, basically, of $250 for all the children who do not qualify for the $1,000 federal seed because they were born before the 1st of January 2025. And it's children eligible for the $1,000 deposit don't receive the $250 they'll supplement. But basically, it's children aged 10 and under, other than the ones who received the grant. And there is an element of targeting in this. It's people living in zip codes with a median household income of $150,000. That's quite interesting because when I devised my original idea, my whole grant idea, I did think about targeting and indeed suggested the idea that if we did target it, it should be targeted according to the average house price in the area in which people lived. And there's an echo of that in this idea. 25 million children. And there are a number of things extraordinary about this. I mean, the sheer scale of it, for starters, is extraordinary. But also, it's a kind of we've talked often about when we talk about the government and the government's role as we've spent a lot of time, and I've done a lot of work on, in fact, the government role as a funder and provider, and the government pulling back from provision and increasingly funding sort of private areas. And this is the government pulling back as a funder, or rather being complemented as a funder. So in a sense, it's almost the privatization of welfare, which is, so far as I am aware, pretty much unique in its operation. And it is a way of sort of taking the capital of one generation, but on a private basis, and distributing it to the other generation. So the funds are administered in the same Trump account and follow the same investment and withdrawal rules. It's worth, I think, saying something about universal capital compared with universal basic income. The fundamental idea, universal basic income its function will be entirely different from the universal basic capital. Universal basic income, going back to that Michael Sheraton quote I mentioned, that income feeds people's bellies, it provides for consumption. The whole idea here of UBC is that it's more of a life belt, helping people, not preventing people from drowning in poverty. That's compared with the UBC, which is more universal basic capital, which is more a springboard. It's giving a springboard to the younger generation. It's a springboard to the younger generation to be able to take off and manage their life course. You have with all that asset effect I talked earlier, the wealth effect, enable them to really exploit the potentialities they're offered. In fact, I think it might be quite a nice idea to combine universal basic capital with a kind of a citizen's day. That you're on when you turn 18, you get this large check. Well, in the days when one got checks, one gets this sum, and you get the right to vote. It's a kind of sort of adult coming of age idea, and it might be quite a good idea to have a ceremony that is a Citizens' Day that provides, as you enter the full adult state of becoming a citizen of the United Kingdom, and or whatever country we're concerned with, and coupled with a kind of celebration of that day. So I'll stop at that point, and we'll just see what comments and ideas people have.
Do you know what percentage of eligible children have a junior ISA to kind of replace? Now, don't get any government money.
No, I don't.
Wouldn't you?
No, I don't. In fact,
Like that year for 18 years.
Yes.
So that really that's pretty low.
Yes, I don't know, and I should know, and I agree. I'm going to explore that and try and find out more about that. Oddly enough, I wrote to the Chancellor John Osborne when the Child Trust Fund was abolished. I expected a great outcry from the countries who protested this. There wasn't any at all. The support that we'd had at the beginning was a sort of mile wide, but it was obviously an inch deep. The only thing I could do was write ineffectually to The Guardian But I did also write to George Osborne suggesting that they set up a junior ISA as a response, which indeed they did. I don't think it was necessarily cause and effect, but yes, that's clearly a kind of it's a rather inadequate substitute, but it is a substitute for the universal basic capital idea.
In some ways, it's more adequate because you can put 9,000 aside of the pot.
You can put more money into it. No, that's true.
Yeah.
Yes. It's £9,000 is the limit, isn't it? You can enter, I think.
Probably
Yes.
not to reach poorer parts of society because there's no good.
Because it hasn't been set up as a, no. Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I wondered if you could expand maybe on 2 points. So the 2 points I'll go into them briefly. First of all, the universality and targeting point, and then secondly on the timing. So on the universality and targeting point, it's interesting to talk about median household income and average house prices. And what we know about inheritance and gifts is that with the baby boomer wealth being very high, and we're seeing more prevalence of gifts that younger ages, but although they are tend to be smaller, larger inheritance should help, for example, asset ownership come much later. So how do you square the circle of people expecting to receive inheritance? They should be targeting, thinking about how much they should maybe receive later in life. How do we target those longer ages? Especially if you know that wealth transfers are going to be very much more frequent and parental wealth becoming more uneven. We know that the top fifth will have much more than this. So how do we square that circle? And secondly, I thought, thinking, do you have thoughts about timing? So does it matter if we give it age 18 or age 20 or age 25? Because more priorities may be different in what that money might be used for, but also how your parents think about when they should give you a gift, if they can give you a gift, and the different priorities. I wonder if you could expand maybe on those points. But thank you so much.
Yes. Well, targeting versus universalism. First of all, I fundamentally prefer the idea of a universal benefit, partly because it's associating with this notion of becoming a citizen and applying to everybody. Partly also, though, because of the problem of the basic of the what you parallel to the poverty trap, to the idea of a success trap. If you have a targeted system, it can be a kind of penalty for success. So the more you succeed, applies to all welfare systems or all welfare benefits. That the more money you make, the more you lose from the state. And so if we targeted this universal battery, well, it became a targeted basic capital system, then those who did manage to increase their capital stock by a variety of different ways would get penalized because they wouldn't get the grant from the government. Now, of course, it does have the problem, and I'm sure I can see Gavin already responding to this, about the cost. And of course, it does obviously make a more substantial cost for it. And of course, and some people would argue too that it will simply enhance inequality rather than increase it, because the middle classes will end up, e.g., saving more into the accounts than the working classes and so on. And I think that is those are two things you have to put on the other side of the balance. But I still the attractive idea of the universality of it, in terms of the kind of the symbolism of becoming a citizen, I still find very attractive. And that relates to the other point about 18 and 25-year-old. As David said, I mean, the Resolution Foundation has suggested a £10,000 grant, but at the age of 25. And again, I could see the arguments. It's something about I suspect one of the arguments is what I've often thought of the kind of Daily Mail objection that these children will get get a large bonus at the age of 18, which they'll just spend on drugs and traveling to Bermuda or whatever. And at 25, they're less likely to do that. And I can see the power of that argument. Again, though, it does rather lose the magic of the kind of Citizens' Day idea of 18-year-old. But I mean, if we do end up with a system, should we ever end up with a system of universal basic income at 25, I wouldn't object.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just like to reflect on the starting universal point, and also just to get a little bit more about that question, but I think my message too. I have to say that we in the Share Foundation, we really are a bit more in the mold of the Dell Foundation from that point of view. Because in 2005, we set up the Share Foundation to add additional money into the accounts for child trust fund accounts of young people in care.
I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's right.
And basically, when the account was withdrawn, and it wasn't totally abolished, as you said, you know, they're still there in huge numbers. 6 million children receive them altogether, and 67% of them are now in mature state. Well, happy, okay, but some happy or more about that later. But actually, when that change came, basically, we were very concerned about that situation for young people in care. And so we campaigned with actually the children of Bernardo's, with George Osborne, and he agreed to bring in the scheme for junior ISAs for young people in care, for which the government makes a very modest contribution of £200. But it's a catalyst. It starts the thing going, and we can identify all the young people in care throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. We work with all 212 local authorities to actually get that account moving. And a lot of those local authorities put extra money into it, and they're very, very engaged with the whole process. So that targeting process, it really does work very effectively. And, you know, I mean, I suppose my question to you is, you know, I do understand what you say about the Citizens' Day and how valuable it would be to have that. But the point is, if you have a choice between actually having a targeted system where you could put in material support in for young people from very disadvantaged backgrounds, and a universal system which was teaching on the edge of whether it was politically possible or not, surely it's better to go for a targeted system.
Well, I certainly, I mean, a target system is better than none. I mean, of course, that's the case. And I like the idea of targeting to, e.g., children in care, because that doesn't suffer from the kind of poverty trap argument I was mentioning earlier, which is, if you're talking about means testing, is closer to that. Yes. Well, maybe we should talk about it some more, and maybe you might convert me. I mean, I still, maybe I have a kind of sort of, you know, sentimental, might be quite not the right term. I've always been in favour of universal benefits rather than means-tested benefits for all the old historical reasons about poverty traps and so on. But I am also aware of the costs, and I note that the Dell contribution is partly means tested and maybe targeting in the way that you've described, but also maybe thinking about targeting in the way that Dell has done it, relating in some senses to the environment in which people live, rather than their immediate means and their immediate income might be the way to go.
Thank you. I looked up some stats on my friend Google Gemini, and a study by AJ Bell suggests that the myth that children will blow the lot the moment they turn 18 is a myth. In fact, they only found that 6.5% of 18-year-olds emptied their JISA account immediately, whilst 33% actually continue to contribute to a new adult ISA. Although at the other end, there is a little bit of gaming in that there's a maxed out elite of only 3% of account holders who contribute. That's about 80,000 children who contribute the full annual limit of £9,000. Now, I was just talking to my colleague here, David, and about the age at which people receive the money, so related to that. we've had a recent change putting pensions back to the purpose, which I think they were originally set up for, which was to provide income during retirement, which apparently has caused some consternation amongst pension contributors. Has that led to a slight diminution in the amount put into pensions? But I'm not sure where I'm going with that actually. What's your view on actually I forgot my point on that, so I'll leave it at that.
Well, the point might have been about restrictions on use. I mean, one of the original ideas behind these grants was that you restrict its use in 4 ways. You can spend it on college fees, upon starting a pension, on deposit for a house, or starting a business in some way. And I still think there is something of a case for that to overcome the Daily Mail objection, although it is very interesting, those figures you've just quoted. And I shall check that out. That's very helpful. There is that kind of rationale. I think one of the problems we thought was how on earth could you enforce it? How could you make sure that people, I mean, for example, starting a business, how would you define that? Or people might start a business and get the grant and immediately close the business.
A question.
Sorry.
So,
wait for the microphone, please.
So I think I read somewhere that people typically inherit at the age of 62, as opposed to
Yes, I saw that.
This concept of giving with a warm hand.
Yeah.
So do you think the changes in inheritance tax treatment of pensions is actually a good thing? As in, they know the pensions don't fall into the estate for inheritance tax purposes.
I don't think I know enough about that to comment, but I certainly think the fact that inheritance occurs mostly at the age of 61 is another classic example in favor of universal basic capital at a young age. I mean, or at least some, or even a targeted scheme at a young age. I mean, it is extraordinary that my children will, as a baby boomer, had all the privileges that David spelled out. My children will inherit at 61 when they don't need it, frankly. They're all doing quite well. They're making some accumulation of wealth, and it's absurd to have it at this time. You know?
Thank you for an excellent and interesting presentation. I'm intrigued by the idea of universal basic capital, but I'm troubled by what I think is a fairly narrow definition of what that capital might encompass.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm given more money at the age of 20, that's great, but I can't buy with any of these style magnitude transfers a more reliable bus service or train service to get me to work. Or I can't buy with something that sort of size a better education from the age of 6 to 18. Seems to me that there's a universal basic social infrastructure that would cover human capital, physical capital, social and institutional capital, things that the individual transfers can't cover.
Well, yes. Well, 2 points there. One is I agree with you about the small amount, and that's why I've always gone for the idea of a £10,000 or a significant sum. One of the interesting things was that the evidence I referred to at the beginning from the longitudinal studies concerning the benefits of owning assets was that the amount of assets necessary in order to obtain these benefits was relatively low at the time. I mean, these are studies that go way back into the 1960s and 70s and so on. But amounts about £2,000 or £3,000 savings made these significant differences that we were talking about. So I think roughly £10,000 could make a significant difference. The point about a collectivity, yes, that's interesting. I gave this a similar talk in France quite recently. And because there are various proposals there to introduce something like this. Thomas Piketty actually has recommended again this. I think he's talking about £10,000 or whatever. And the strong objection there was that this was too individualistic, that collectivist, we ought to be putting this money into collectivist provision, things like better public transport, things like better education. And they say the Liberal Democrats were one of the few people who objected to the Child Trust Fund when it was first set up, and they were saying the same argument, that really the money, it would be better put the money into education than capital. My view on that is that, well, we're already putting a lot of money into education and indeed into transport. Not enough money, I'm sure, but nonetheless, and the marginal impact of an extra £250 per baby, per child, or whatever, will be so tiny in that case. Whereas here we've got a chance to make a real difference to people's life courses, and with a very significant marginal impact to do that.
To my mind, one of the issues is not so much giving the young relatively modest lump sums, taking away for the aspiring young a huge potential liability, namely university fees. To my mind, I'm that's the writer says it, but I think university fees are big nonsense. Should be free at point of view certification up to in tertiary education. And the reality with the university debt is that at the moment the Treasury is busy selling off that debt at £50 billion. The likelihood of a lot of people repaying that debt is limited. It's providing a longer, psychologically, practically, people's ambition and want a career. The more they earn, the more they have to pay off. Yet there's no debate about the alternative to dealing with university debt, like abolishing. And to my mind, if there's going to be a good use of IHT or whatever other factors would be part, it would be much better off to abolish university debt and give more people more aspiration and take that burden away from them.
Yes, I'm in two minds about that. I was one of the people who advocated the idea of a graduate tax. I was, this was in the 1970s and 80s, when it did seem extraordinarily unfair that we devoted large sums of money to subsidizing the children of the middle class, and indeed the upper class, through a grant system or a system where you had no fees for university, compared with at that time, the majority of the relevant age cohort that did not go to university and did not receive any kind of subsidy of that kind. Well, we've now moved to a somewhat different system where we do have where we have, I think it's now, not sure it's quite reached 50% of the cohort, but it's a very high proportion of the cohort goes to university. You've still got the problem of the 50% that do not, and they do not receive any kind of subsidy. And I suppose we could argue in terms of, we're going to go for targeting, that perhaps that group we should target, so that they do not get the subsidy. So they receive the kind of subsidy that if we were to abolish fees and so on, we would give to universities. So that might be the way to proceed. I still would prefer the language to talk about, I'd like to change the university loan system to something more like a graduate tax, where it's simply levied on a proportion of income above a certain threshold, which is not wholly unlike the present system, but I think the language matters, and to talk about it as a tax rather than a loan would be a better system. But I do agree with you that I think we have to address that, because it does affect all these universal basic capital ideas, the fact that there's also a large proportion of the population in what they perceive to be substantial debt.